The cathedral was gone. Marin Estelle stood in what had been the nave, boots crunching through 4,000 years of calcified debris, and stared at the place where the altar once held a candle that never went out. Now there was only a crater, scorch-glazed stone, fused into glass by plasma fire so intense it had turned marble into something that looked like frozen water. She pressed 2 fingers against it, still warm. Not from the ancient strike from the survey drones overhead, their scanning beams heating the surface as they mapped every scar. Thermal profile confirms consistent with Verathari cleansing ordnance, Lieutenant Don said behind her, reading from his wrist display. Deuterium-laced plasma, surface temperature during impact estimated at 14,000 degrees. The entire structure would have collapsed in under 9 seconds. 9 seconds. Marin pulled her hand back and wiped it on her jacket. The cathedral at Thessaly had stood for 1,100 years before the Verathari arrived. 1,100 years of stone and song, of human hands carving faces into pillars, of children's choirs echoing under vaulted ceilings that reached so high they seemed to touch something beyond architecture. 9 seconds to erase it. She had done the mathematics once, lying awake on a thin mattress in a tunnel beneath the Western agricultural grid. If you divided 1,100 years by 9 seconds, you got roughly 3.85 billion seconds of existence destroyed per second of plasma fire. The number meant nothing in practical terms. But Marin was not interested in practical terms. She was interested in the shape of the debt. She turned and looked at the 43 people behind her. They were not soldiers, not anymore, not yet. They were the thing that comes between the remnant. Engineers who had survived because they were underground when the orbital strikes began. Medics who crawled out of collapsed hospitals with their hands still wrapped in someone else's bandages. Teachers who taught children in bunkers for 3 generations and then taught their grandchildren in the ruins after the bunkers ran out of air recyclers. A woman named Tessa Keel who had once been a concert cellist and now ran decryption analysis on intercepted Verathari data transmissions. Her fingers still precise, still patient, trained by decades of sheet music for a different kind of notation. Marin had assembled them over 11 months, one at a time, from 17 scattered settlements across what remained of the northern continent. Each recruitment had been a calculation not just of competence, but of steadiness. She needed people who could hold a thing inside them for years without it shaking loose. They called themselves the 6th candle, not because it meant anything to anyone outside their cell. Because the cathedral at Thessaly had held 6 candles on its altar, and 5 of them had been found in the rubble melted, fused, unrecognizable, but the 6th was never recovered. It was simply gone, taken by the heat or by something else. The absence bothered Marin more than the destruction. Destruction left evidence. Absence left nothing. She had built a resistance cell around that absence, named it for the missing thing, and filled it with people who understood what it meant to keep searching for something that might not exist anymore. How long, she asked. Don checked his display. 71 hours, 14 minutes to synchronization window. 71 hours, 3 days. In 3 days, every resistance cell on the planet, and there were cells on every continent now, 209 of them, linked by a communication network so low-tech the Verathari's quantum intercept arrays couldn't detect it, would act simultaneously. Not attack. Not yet. First, they would make the Verathari understand what they had burned. Marin walked out of the crater and into the light. The sky above the ruins was the wrong color. It had been the wrong color for 4,000 years. The Verathari atmospheric processors had turned Earth's sky from blue to a pale amber, optimized for their visual spectrum, better for their crops, more comfortable for their administrative caste. The processors were massive cylindrical towers, 112 meters tall, spaced in a grid across every continent, pumping a continuous stream of atmospheric modification compounds into the upper troposphere. They ran on deuterium-fueled plasma cores, the same plasma that had burned the cathedrals. The Verathari saw no irony in this. Irony required a sense of proportion, and proportion was not something they calculated. Humans had been born and died under that amber sky for so many generations that most of them didn't know it had ever been different. Marin did. She had found photographs in a sealed archive 3 years ago, in the collapsed subbasement of what the Varathari Geological Surveys identified as pre-clearing structure, no resource value, seismic risk class 3. The archive had been sealed with an analog lock, a physical key, turned in a physical cylinder. The Varathari scanning systems did not look for analog locks because they did not believe analog security served any purpose. Marin had found the key in the skeleton's pocket. The photographs were printed on paper, actual paper, sealed in nitrogen-filled cases. Blue sky, white clouds, green that was actually green instead of the muted olive that amber light made of every living thing. She had held the photographs under a chemical lantern and studied them until the colors burned into her memory. A blue so deep and clear it looked manufactured. Clouds so white they seemed to glow from within. And everywhere, in every image, light that fell clean and unfiltered through an atmosphere that belonged to the planet. She had shown the photographs to her cell. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Oben, the oldest among them at 91, said quietly, "They changed the color of our sky and we forgot." That was the day the sixth candle stopped being a memory group and became something else. The Varathari had not intended cruelty. That was the part that ground against Marin's patience like sand in a wound. They were not conquerors in the way humans understood conquest. No jackboots, no flags planted in the rubble, no speeches about superiority. They were administrators. They had arrived 40 centuries ago in a fleet of processing vessels, not warships, processing vessels. The distinction mattered to them, and catalogued Earth the way a surveyor catalogues a property before demolition. The atmosphere was suboptimal. The indigenous structures interfered with resource extraction grids. The population was manageable, useful for certain manual tasks that their automation found inefficient to replicate in variable terrain. So they optimized. They burned the cathedrals, the temples, the mosques, the libraries, the concert halls, the museums, anything that served no extractive or administrative function. They called it the clearing, not even a proper noun in their language, a gerund, an ongoing process like weeding. The administrative documentation, and there was a great deal of administrative documentation, because the Varathari documented everything, listed the destroyed structures under a category that translated roughly as cultural surplus inventory, scheduled for removal. The word surplus did more damage to Marin's composure than any image of plasma fire ever could. Surplus meant excess. It meant the cathedrals were too much. 1100 years of stone and song, and the Varathari's assessment was that Earth had more beauty than it needed. Marin's great-grandmother, 27 times removed, had watched the clearing from a hillside. The account had been passed down through oral tradition for 4 millennia, and Marin suspected it had been worn smooth by repetition, the sharp edges of horror polished into something more like myth. But one detail never changed. The Varathari had been polite. An administrator had appeared on every broadcast frequency and explained in fluent human languages that the structures being removed were culturally redundant, and that replacement facilities optimized for human biological needs would be provided. Housing, nutrition centers, medical stations. All superior to what they were replacing. The administrator had even thanked them for their patience. Then the orbital strikes began, and in 11 hours, 4,000 years of human civilization was reduced to thermal glass and particulate clouds that took 3 years to settle. Marin, Don's voice pulled her back. The relay from Cell 9 just came through. She took the thin slip of film from his hand. The communication system was deliberately primitive messages encoded in organic dye on biodegradable film, carried by runners between cells, the dye designed to degrade in ultraviolet light within 6 hours of unsealing. No electronic signature. No quantum trace. The Varathari had spent centuries trying to understand how the human resistance communicated and had concluded, in a report Marin's intelligence team had intercepted, that humans possessed some form of latent telepathy. They did not. They possessed stubbornness and a willingness to run through the dark carrying scraps of film that would dissolve in sunlight. The absurdity of it was its own kind of armor. The Varathari could not defend against a communication system. They could not conceptualize. And they could not conceptualize a communication system built on the premise that sometimes the slowest method is the safest. The message read, 9 confirms, CHARGES set, atmospheric processors gamma 7 through gamma 12, awaiting window. Marin folded the film and held it up to the amber sky. The dye began to fade immediately. Within minutes it would be blank. 6 atmospheric processors. Cell 9 had spent 4 years infiltrating the maintenance crews, learning the systems, identifying the cascade points where a failure in one processor would stress the adjacent units beyond their tolerances. They had manufactured the charges from mining explosives stolen in quantities so small, grams at a time, over years, that the inventory discrepancies fell within normal variants. 17 grams in the March allocation, 22 in June, 14 in November. Each theft noted by the automated inventory system, each discrepancy flagged, and each flag reviewed by a Varathari auditor who concluded that the variance was within acceptable parameters for material degradation in the mining environment. The auditors had noted the variance in 17 consecutive quarterly reports and filed it under acceptable material degradation. Because that was what the Varathari did. They filed things. They filed the evidence of their own unmaking and stamped it with a quarterly approval code. Cell 12, Marin asked. Confirmed 6 hours ago. Power grid substations along the southern corridor. They estimate 68% grid failure in the administrative zone within 4 minutes of detonation. Cell 3. Confirmed, communication relay towers. All 9 primary nodes. Cell 22. Confirmed at last contact. Atmospheric processor North 3 and the adjacent fuel depot. Cell 47. Confirmed. Automated defense nodes in the western perimeter, all 6 units. Marin nodded. She had a map in her head, not drawn, never drawn, because anything drawn could be found. 209 cells, 1,612 targets, every atmospheric processor on the planet, every power grid substation serving a Varathari administrative zone, every communication relay that connected the ground administrators to the orbital station, every fuel depot, every automated defense node that they had mapped over decades of patient observation. Every single piece of infrastructure the Varathari had built to replace what they had burned. The strike would not destroy the Varathari. Marin understood that with the cold clarity that had replaced whatever softer thing had once lived in the same space inside her chest. The Varathari still had their orbital station, their processing fleet in high orbit, their manufacturing capacity, their vast reserves of deuterium and atmospheric compounds stored in orbital warehouses. Within weeks, they could rebuild. Within months, they could restore everything. The strike was not designed to win a war. The resistance did not have the capacity to win a war, not yet. Not with 43 people in a basement and 208 other cells scattered across a planet that the Varathari had administered for longer than most human civilizations had existed. But for one day, the amber sky would begin to shift. The atmospheric processors would fail, and Earth's atmosphere would start reverting to its natural composition. Not enough to turn the sky blue, not in a day, but enough that anyone who looked up would see the color change, would see the amber begin to crack like a shell and something older bleeding through underneath. That was the message, not the destruction, the reminder. We remember what you took. We remember what color the sky was. And we have been counting the years. Marin returned to the command post, a basement beneath a collapsed nutrition center, shored up with salvaged beams, lit by chemical lanterns because any electrical light could be detected by the Verathari's passive sensor grid. The room was 12 meters by 8. It held a table made from a door, 14 chairs that didn't match, and the most sophisticated tactical coordination system ever built from string, paper, and human memory. Yale-san sat at the table, surrounded by strips of biodegradable film arranged in a pattern that looked random, but encoded the status of every cell in the Western Hemisphere. She was 53 years old, had been a structural engineer before she joined the Sixth Candle, and possessed the kind of memory that bordered on the clinical. She could recall the exact sequence of 1,700 coded messages without writing any of them down. Marin had tested her once, skeptically, reading message numbers out of sequence and asking Yale to recite the content. Yale had recited the last 40 messages in reverse order, including the timestamps, without pausing. When she finished, she had looked at Marin and said, "The 41st was about a fuel depot in Sector 12. Shall I continue?" "We have a problem," Yale said without looking up. Marin pulled a chair to the table. "Tell me." "Cell 41 went silent 14 hours ago." They were scheduled to confirm at 6-hour intervals. 2 missed windows. Silence in a resistance cell meant one of 3 things: communication failure, voluntary radio silence due to perceived threat, or capture. The first was common and recoverable. The second was protocol, a cell that sensed danger would go dark to protect the network. The third was the end, because captured operatives could not hold out indefinitely against the Verathari's interrogation methods. "Location?" Marin asked. "Eastern seaboard." They were responsible for the desalination grid and the secondary communication relays in Sector 8. 12 operatives, led by Hassan Rourke. "Can another cell absorb their targets?" Yale shook her head. "Cell 42 could take the relays, they have the range. But the desalination grid requires physical access to the subsurface conduits. The charges are already placed, but they need to be armed manually within 4 hours of detonation. 41 spent 2 years mapping those conduits, finding the access points, timing the Verathari maintenance patrols. Nobody else has the routes." Marin sat with that for a moment. The plan could absorb losses. She had designed it to absorb losses up to 15% of cells could fail, and the coordinated strike would still achieve critical cascade across the atmospheric processor network. But each failure narrowed the margin, and each narrowed margin meant a less complete result. And Cell 41 was not the first silence. Cell 19 had gone dark a week ago. 8 operatives in the northern industrial zone, responsible for 3 fuel depots and a defense node. Cell 7, 3 days before that, 6 operatives on the western agricultural belt, responsible for 2 atmospheric processors. "How many cells have we lost in the last 30 days?" she asked. 5 confirmed silent. 2 returned to contact after temporary blackouts, both attributed to runner route disruptions from Verathari construction activity. 3 remain dark. 19, 7, 41, plus Cell 88 on the southern coast and Cell 130 near the central administrative perimeter. 5 cells out of 209, 2.4%, within tolerance. But the pattern bothered Marin in a way that tolerance calculations could not address. She pulled the map from her memory, the one that existed nowhere but inside her skull, the one she had built over 4 years of recruitment and coordination, every cell's position and capability stored in the same disciplined architecture that Yale used for message recall, and placed each lost cell on it. Eastern seaboard, northern industrial zone, western agricultural belt, southern coast. Central administrative perimeter. A ring. The losses formed a ring, contracting inward toward the Verathari's central administrative complex. "They're running a sweep," Marin said. Yale looked up. Her expression didn't change, but her hand stopped moving over the film strips. "You're sure?" "The pattern is consistent with Verathari security methodology. They don't search outward from a point of suspicion. They secure inward. They define a perimeter around what they consider their highest value zone and compress it, tightening the radius one sector at a time. Every cell we've lost is on the outer edge of the administrative radius. They're not hunting us specifically, they're cleaning their perimeter, and our cells are getting caught in the sweep. If they're sweeping inward, they'll reach the inner cells within 48 hours, maybe less. The sweep rate is consistent with standard Verathari administrative security rotation, 2 sectors per day, 3 auditors per sector, full subsurface scan capability. 48 hours. The synchronization window was in 71. A 23-hour gap that yawned like a fault line through the center of everything Marin had built. If the Verathari sweep reached the inner cells before the coordinated strike, not only would those cells be neutralized, their charges discovered, their operatives detained, but the captured operatives might reveal the timing. The Verathari were patient interrogators. They did not use pain, they found it inefficient, a crude tool that produced unreliable data. They used chemical compliance agents that dissolved resistance the way their plasma dissolved marble, slowly, completely, and without leaving marks. A detained operative would hold out for hours, perhaps a day. Then the chemicals would do what chemicals do, and the timing of the strike would be in the Verathari's damage report files, alongside every other variance. Marin stood. We moved the window. Don, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. Marin, we can't. The synchronization requires every cell to act within the same 90-second window. If we change the timing, we have to notify all 209 cells through the runner network. That takes a minimum of 60 hours. The farthest cells are in the southern hemisphere, and the runner routes through the equatorial zone add an extra 16 hours of transit. Then we don't use the runner network. The room went quiet. Even the chemical lantern seemed to dim, though that was a trick of attention when something important enough was said in a small enough room. The silence afterward had weight. The runner network was sacred. It was the one thing the Verathari had never detected, never compromised, never even conceptualized as a possibility. Every other communication method had been tried and broken over the centuries. Radio, intercepted within hours of the first resistance broadcasts. Digital signals cracked before they reached their destination, the Verathari's quantum processing infrastructure reading the encryption like a child reading picture books. Quantum encrypted bursts laughable, because the Verathari had built their entire administrative framework on quantum processing, and could read encrypted traffic the way humans read billboards. Laser line relays detected by atmospheric particulate sensors. Sonic communication, filtered out by the ambient noise monitoring systems that the Verathari maintained for environmental assessment. Every method that relied on speed or technology, the Verathari broke. Because speed and technology were their language. But the runners, humans carrying biodegradable film through tunnels and ruins, moving at the speed of human legs, navigating by memory through routes that changed weekly, had operated for 200 years without a single confirmed interception. Because the Verathari did not believe that any civilization would choose to communicate at walking speed when faster methods existed, it was, to them, irrational, a deficiency, a sign of the species' fundamental limitation, and the Verathari had no framework for irrational behavior producing superior results, because their entire civilization was built on the premise that optimization always won. The bell system, Marin said. Yale's hands went still on the table. You want to use the bell system. I want to use the bell system. The bell system was the contingency. The one-time use, irreversible, burn-after-firing contingency that Marin had built into the plan from the beginning, because she understood in the same cold, architectural way. She understood everything about this operation, that no plan survives contact with the Verathari's administrative thoroughness. The bell system was not a communication network. It was a chain of acoustic relays, physical bells, cast from scavenged metal, hidden in ruins and tunnels across the planet, each one positioned within audible range of the next through the subsurface tunnel network. A single bell rung at the starting point would be heard by the nearest relay operator, who would ring their bell, which would be heard by the next, cascading across the entire planet at the speed of sound through stone. The message was binary: the bell rings or it doesn't. One ring meant go. Now, everything happens now. It could not be used twice. The Varathari would triangulate the acoustic signatures within minutes and destroy every relay they could find. The bell system was a weapon that destroyed itself in the firing. Priya Vasan, who had spent 9 years casting and tuning each bell, had understood this when she began. She had tuned each one for a single perfect ring, not for durability. One ring, one chance. If we ring the bell, every cell acts immediately, Marin said. No 90-second window, no synchronization. Staggered detonations across the planet over a period of what? 40 minutes, depending on distance from the origin bell. 37 minutes for full propagation, Yale said. I calculated it when we set the relays. 340 meters per second through the tunnel network, total propagation distance approximately 750 kilometers through the subsurface routes, plus relay response time at each node. 37 minutes of staggered detonations instead of 90 seconds of synchronized ones. The cascade effect will be less efficient. Processor failures won't compound as cleanly. Grid collapse will be partial instead of total. Estimated 61% effectiveness instead of 94%, Yale said. She said it the way she said everything precisely, without opinion. The number was the number. Marin looked at the table, at the strips of film that represented 4 years of work, 11 months of assembly, 200 years of runner networks, and 4,000 years of patience. 61%. It meant the sky would shift for maybe 6 hours instead of 24. It meant the Varathari would regain control faster. It meant the statement, the reminder, would be shorter, dimmer, less complete. But it would happen. And if they waited for the original window, the sweep might reach the inner cells first, and nothing would happen at all. 4 years of work, 11 months of recruitment, 200 years of runner tradition, 4,000 years of memory. All of it dissolving under the Varathari's chemical compliance, agents in an interrogation room that smelled like antiseptic. Ring the bell, she said. Don did not hesitate. He pulled on his tunnel jacket, checked his chemical lantern, and left through the basement service exit, a narrow passage that led through 300 meters of hand-dug tunnel to the ruins above. The origin bell was 17 minutes away on foot, hidden in the basement of a structure the Varathari had catalogued as collapsed residential unit, no extractive value, seismic risk class 4. It was a bronze bell, cast by hand from melted plumbing fixtures, tuned to a frequency that carried well through stone and soil. Priya Vasan had spent 9 years tuning it, testing it in the tunnels at night, adjusting its shape gram by gram with a hand file until the sound carried exactly the distance needed to reach the first relay. She had died 2 years ago, a heart failure in her sleep, nothing dramatic, the ordinary failing of a body that had worked too hard for too long. Marin had carried the bell to its hiding place herself. 17 minutes, Marin used them. She pulled every strip of film on the table toward her and began reading. Each one was a confirmation, a status report, a fragment of the enormous machine she had built from nothing but people and patience. She read them not for information. She already had the information, but for the names. Every strip carried a cell designation, and behind every designation were people she had recruited, trained, trusted, and in some cases buried. Cell 14, Gal Mott, former mining engineer, lost his daughter in a Varathari population optimization in the northern settlements 20 years ago. The Varathari had determined that the settlement's population exceeded the efficient labor ratio for the adjacent mine. The ratio was 1 laborer per 2.3 cubic meters of daily extraction, and the settlement had 7% more humans than the ratio required. So they reduced it. The reduction was orderly. An administrator visited the settlement, explained the calculation, thanked the residents for their understanding, and removed 30% of the population to a relocation facility that existed on the administrative documentation, but not on the surface of the planet. Gal's daughter was 4 years old. The Varathari administrator who signed the order had noted, in the margin of the documentation, that the optimization would improve quarterly output by an estimated 2.3%. Marin had found that document in an intercepted data cache. She had read the margin note 7 times. 2.3%. A 4-year-old girl reduced to a percentage improvement in a quarterly report. Then she had set the document down and not spoken for 3 hours. When she spoke again, she asked Yale to calculate how many atmospheric processors existed on the planet. Yale told her, 412. Marin nodded and said, "We're going to shut down every one of them." That was 2 years ago. The plan had grown since then. It had grown because the offense had grown, because every new document they intercepted, every new margin note they read, every new optimization they witnessed added another target to the list. Not out of rage. Marin was careful about that. Rage made mistakes. Rage moved too fast or too slow. Rage forgot details. What Marin felt was something colder and more durable, a precise, architectural understanding that the Varathari had not merely conquered Earth but had edited it. They had taken the human world and revised it the way a clerk revises a ledger, crossing out entries that didn't balance, replacing them with numbers that did. And they had done it politely, efficiently, with margin notes and quarterly reports and polite broadcasts that thanked the population for their patience. The bell would be the first sound the Varathari heard that was not in their ledger. 12 minutes after Dawn left, Marin heard it. Not with her ears, the origin bell was too far away for that, but through the floor. A vibration that traveled through the stone foundations of the collapsed nutrition center, up through the salvaged beams, and into the soles of her boots. A single, low, sustained tone that lasted 4 seconds, and then faded into the stone like a word spoken once, and then held in memory. Yale looked at her. "It's ringing." Marin nodded. Somewhere, 17 minutes away, Dawn had struck the bronze bell with a hammer wrapped in leather, the wrapping designed to produce a clean fundamental tone, without the higher harmonics that the Varathari's atmospheric sensors were calibrated to detect. The sound was traveling now not through the air above, where the Varathari's acoustic arrays could filter it, but through the subsurface network of tunnels and ruins that humans had been building, expanding, and connecting for centuries. Stone carried sound beautifully. The first relay operator would hear it within seconds. They would ring their bell. The next operator would hear that and ring theirs. A chain of sound propagating at 340 meters per second through corridors of stone, each ring identical, each interval precise, reaching farther and faster than any runner, carrying the simplest message ever composed. Now. Marin pulled on her jacket and picked up the detonator from beneath the table. It was mechanical, a spring-loaded striker connected to a physical cable that ran through a conduit to the charges they had placed in the atmospheric processor's intake manifold 300 meters east. No electronics, no signal, no quantum signature. A human hand pulling a lever connected to a spring connected to a cable connected to a detonator. The Varathari could intercept every quantum signal in the solar system, and they would not detect this. Because it was not a signal, it was a lever. "Charges are live," Yale confirmed, checking the cable tension with a hand-cranked gauge. Continuity confirmed on all 4 lines. 4 charges, placed over 19 months by 4 different operatives, each one entering the processor maintenance tunnels on legitimate work assignments, routine maintenance of the cooling conduits, a task the Varathari assigned to human workers, because their automation struggled with the variable geometry of hand-carved tunnels. each operative carrying less than 200 grams of explosive concealed in equipment bags that passed Verathari scanning because the explosive's chemical signature was identical to a common industrial sealant. The scanners were looking for weapons. Sealant was not a weapon. Until it was. Timer, Marin said. Yale set a mechanical chronometer on the table, a spring wound device, no electronics, no signal. Bell propagation to the nearest confirmed cell, cell 22, 14 kilometers northeast, estimated 41 seconds. They'll detonate on receipt. And the farthest? Cell 193, Southern Hemisphere, 36 minutes and 40 seconds. 37 minutes. In 37 minutes, 1,600 targets across the planet would begin to detonate, and the Verathari's infrastructure would start to fail. Not all at once. Not in the clean, synchronized cascade Marin had planned for 4 years. But in a rolling wave of failures that would sweep across the planet like a tide coming in, each failure stressing adjacent systems, each stress creating new failures, the whole network of processors and grids and relays degrading not like a building collapsing, but like a body shutting down organ by organ, system by system, each loss making the next one worse, each worse loss accelerating the next. 20 seconds to estimated cell 22 detonation, Yale said. Marin placed her hand on the detonator lever. She did not pull it yet. Cell 22 would go first. Then the cells in the immediate radius would follow, each one adding its weight to the cascade. The sixth candle's own target atmospheric processor, East 17, would detonate when Marin pulled the lever, adding to the cascade from this position. But she wanted to hear it first. She wanted to hear the first one go. She wanted to feel, through the stone, the moment when 4,000 years of patience became something the Verathari could measure. 7 seconds, 5, 3. The floor shuddered. Not violently, a tremor, like a heavy vehicle passing on a distant road, but Marin knew what it was. 14 kilometers northeast, Cell 22 had just detonated their charges in the intake manifold of atmospheric processor North 3. The processor was failing now. Its plasma containment would breach within seconds, the superheated gas that maintained the amber atmospheric composition in a 12-kilometer radius venting uncontrolled into the sky. Within an hour, the air in that radius would begin to change. Within 3 hours, if you knew what to look for, you might see the amber thinning at the edges, a crack in the shell. Cell 22 confirmed, Yale said, reading the tremor's direction on a mechanical seismograph they had built from salvaged parts, a weighted pendulum over a smoked glass plate, 19th century technology that the Verathari had never thought to scan for because it produced no electronic signature. Bearing consistent with processor North 3. Another tremor, sharper this time, closer. Cell 38, 8 kilometers south. Their target was the power grid substation that fed the Verathari's Southern Administrative Office, a building where 200 Verathari auditors processed the quarterly reports that governed every aspect of human life on the planet. The lights in that building were going dark now. Another, Cell 15, 11 kilometers west. 2 atmospheric processors and a fuel depot. The wave was moving. Marin could feel it in the floor, in the walls, in the air itself, a rhythm of impacts like a heartbeat accelerating. Each pulse a cell acting on the bell's message, each pulse a target dying, each pulse a piece of the Verathari's revised Earth being unrevised. She pulled the lever. The mechanical striker fired. The spring released. The cable transmitted the force through 300 meters of conduit to the charges in processor East 17's intake manifold. Marin felt the detonation not as sound, but as absence, a sudden vacuum of pressure as the manifold breached and the processor's containment failed. Then the sound arrived, delayed by distance, a deep, hollow thud that traveled through the stone and settled in her chest like a second heartbeat that had been waiting to start. East 17 is down, Yale said. Marin let go of the lever. Her hand was steady. It had been steady for 4 years, through every recruitment conversation held in whispers, every planning session conducted in basements and tunnels, every moment when she lay awake in the dark calculating the odds of success and finding them wanting and deciding to proceed anyway. Steadiness was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to let fear exist somewhere in the background, like ambient noise in a room you have learned to work in, while the hands did what they were trained to do. The tremors continued. Every few seconds, another one. Some were barely perceptible cells detonating at the edge of sensory range. Their contributions to the cascade felt only as faint shifts in the seismograph's needle. Others were sharp and immediate nearby cells, their targets close enough that the detonation shockwave rattled the chemical lanterns on their hooks and sent small cascades of dust from the ceiling beams. The map in Marin's head updated with each tremor. North 3 down, South 14 down, West 7 down, East 17 down. The network was degrading exactly as modeled, not cleanly, not symmetrically, but inevitably. Don returned at minute 19, breathing hard, his boots covered in tunnel dust, his jacket dark with sweat. Bell confirmed propagated past Relay 47. Southern Hemisphere chain is active. I could hear the relays echoing back through the cross tunnels. It sounded like the whole planet was humming. Casualties? Marin asked. Cell 22 reports one operative injured in the detonation shrapnel from the manifold wall. They didn't expect it to fragment laterally. She's stable, ambulatory. Cell 38 is clean. Cell 15 lost their secondary charge. It failed to detonate, probably a moisture-degraded detonator cap, but the primary was sufficient to breach containment on both processors. One injured, one failed charge. Marin did not allow herself to feel relief. Relief was premature. The Verathari had not yet responded. That changed at minute 23. The sound came from above, not a tremor through the floor, but a high, sustained tone that cut through the stone ceiling like a blade through cloth. Marin knew the sound. Every human on Earth knew the sound. It was the Verathari administrative broadcast frequency, the tone that preceded every announcement, every optimization notice, every polite explanation that something was about to be taken away. "They're broadcasting," Yale said. Marin climbed the stairs to the surface. The amber sky was changing. She could see it, a faint discoloration at the horizon, like a bruise forming on skin. The atmospheric processors in the immediate area were down, and the air was already beginning to shift. Not blue yet, not even close, but the amber was less certain than it had been an hour ago. Less solid, less total, like a conviction that had never been questioned beginning to receive its first question. The broadcast was in the Verathari's administrative tone, calm, measured, the verbal equivalent of a margin note. Attention, surface population. Multiple infrastructure failures have been detected across atmospheric processing zones. Remain in designated areas. Repair operations are being coordinated. There is no cause for concern. No cause for concern. Marin almost smiled. Almost. The Verathari had just watched 140 of their atmospheric processors fail in 23 minutes, and their first response was to issue a calm advisory. Because that was what they did. They administered. They filed. They noted the variance and moved to correct it. The variance was larger than any they had recorded in 4,000 years of occupation, but the procedure was the same. Note the variance. File the report. Optimize the response. There was something almost admirable about it, the way a clockwork mechanism is admirable, doing exactly what it was built to do regardless of what is happening around it. But they could not correct this fast enough. Because while the atmospheric processors were failing, the power grid substations were also failing, and the communication relays were going dark, and the fuel depots were venting uncontrolled, and the automated defense nodes were losing their uplinks to the orbital station. The cascade was not a single thread being cut. It was a net being dissolved, strand by strand, and the Verathari's ability to coordinate their response was degrading at the same rate as the infrastructure they were trying to repair. They were filing damage reports through communication relays that were themselves becoming damaged. At minute 31, the broadcast cut out, not gradually, abruptly, mid-sentence. Repair operations are proceeding on schedule. All personnel should, and then silence. The communication relays had failed. For the first time in 4,000 years, the Verathari administrators on the surface could not reach their orbital station. Marin stood in the ruins of the cathedral and watched the sky. The amber was thinning visibly now. Not everywhere the processors on the far side of the planet were still functioning, the bell's message still propagating through the southern hemisphere tunnels, but here, in the zone where the first detonations had occurred, the sky was showing something it hadn't shown in 40 centuries. A faint, pale wash of color at the edges of the clouds. Not blue, not yet, but not amber either. Something between, something transitional, something that said the amber was not permanent. That it had always been a layer, not a truth. Marin, Yale had followed her up. She was looking at her mechanical seismograph portable model held in one hand. Orbital response. Marin looked up. High above, at the edge of visibility, she could see them, bright points of light descending through the atmosphere, too fast and too regular to be debris. Drop ships. The Verathari were deploying surface forces from the orbital station. How many? Marin asked. Seismograph can't read that, but the descent pattern is consistent with a full administrative security deployment, 6 to 8 processing vessels, each carrying repair teams and military escort. Time to reach surface. 14 minutes at standard descent rate. 14 minutes. Marin had planned for this. Not this exact scenario, the Bell contingency had never been the preferred plan, but the response pattern. The Verathari were predictable in the way that all administrative systems are predictable. They followed procedure. They would send repair teams to the highest priority targets first, atmospheric processors, because the atmosphere was their most visible modification, and its failure would be the most psychologically destabilizing. Not to humans. To the Verathari administrators, who had spent 4 millennia maintaining the amber atmosphere as a point of professional pride. They would focus on restoration. They would file the event as an infrastructure failure, perhaps attributable to coordinated sabotage, and they would begin optimizing their response. They would not, in those first 14 minutes, understand what was actually happening. Because what was actually happening was not sabotage. Sabotage was tactical, it sought to damage. This was something older and more fundamental. This was a statement made in the only language the Verathari could not file, the language of what was underneath. Marin reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a candle, not the 6th candle from the cathedral at Thessaly that had never been found. This was a new one, made from rendered tallow and a cotton wick, poured into a shape that approximated what the cathedral's candles had looked like based on descriptions passed down through oral tradition for 4,000 years. It was imperfect. The proportions were probably wrong. The wax was the wrong color. It didn't matter. It was a candle set in a place where a candle had once stood, and the act of setting it there was the act of saying, "This place is not gone. This place is remembered. This place will be rebuilt." She set it on the scorched glazed stone where the altar had been and lit it with a friction match. The flame was small and steady in the still air. It cast a circle of warm light on the glass-smooth crater, and for a moment, standing in the ruins of a cathedral that had been dead for 4 millennia, Marin Estelle could see both fires, the one that had destroyed this place in 9 seconds and the one she had just lit, which would last until the wax was gone or the wind took it. One fire had been 14,000 degrees. This one was perhaps 400. The difference between them was not temperature, it was intent. The Verathari would not understand the candle. They would catalog it if they found it, note its chemical composition, file it under miscellaneous cultural artifact, no extractive value. They would not understand why a woman would stand in a ruin and light a small fire in a place where a large fire had once ended everything. Intent was not a category in their filing system. But the 43 people of the sixth candle understood, and the 208 other cells understood. And every human on the planet who looked up at the changing sky today would understand, even if they couldn't name what they were feeling, even if they had been born under amber light and had never seen a photograph of blue. The sky was cracking, and underneath the crack something old was showing through. At minute 37, Yale appeared at Marin's side. Full propagation confirmed. All cells that were active have detonated. Estimated processor failures, 261 of 412, 63%. 63%, higher than the 61% estimate. Marin noted it the way she noted everything precisely, without celebration. 261 atmospheric processors down. The Verathari's atmospheric modification would degrade across 63% of the planet's surface within hours. The remaining processors would be stressed by the increased load, each one compensating for the adjacent failures, running above capacity, heating beyond design parameters. Some of them would fail under the strain, pushing the number higher. By tomorrow, the figure might reach 75 or 80%. By the day after, perhaps higher. Grid failures, Marin asked. 54% of administrative zone substations confirmed down. Communication relays at 71% failure. Fuel depots at 43%. Defense nodes at 39%. Cells reporting casualties. Yale paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was precision. 11 cells report injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to a broken arm from a tunnel collapse. 3 cells report fatalities. Cell 112 lost 2 operatives when their target's secondary containment failed catastrophically. The blast radius exceeded their egress calculations by 40 meters. Cell 89 lost 1 to a structural collapse during egress. Cell 204 lost 1 cause unknown, possibly Verathari security response. 4 dead. 4 people who had trusted Marin's plan, Marin's timing, Marin's judgment. 4 people who would not see the sky change color. Marin held their names in her mind the way she held everything else carefully, precisely, in a place where they would not fade. She did not close her eyes. She did not lower her head. She looked at the sky, where the amber was thinning in long, ragged streaks, like paint wearing off a surface that had been underneath all along. Log their names, she said. Already done. The Verathari dropships were landing now. Marin could see dust plumes rising from the administrative zone 3 kilometers east, where the processing vessels were touching down and deploying their repair teams. The response would be systematic. The Verathari would assess, prioritize, repair, and restore. Within the hour, the first processors would be coming back online. Within a day, the grid would stabilize. Within a week, the amber sky would close over the cracks like skin over a wound. But not yet. Right now, at this moment, the sky was open, and every human who looked up could see it. Marin turned to Yale. Send the post-action message. Yale produced a fresh strip of biodegradable film and a stylus of organic dye. What do we tell them? Marin considered. The message would go out through the runner network to every surviving cell. It would be the first communication after the strike, the first assessment, the first instruction for what came next. It needed to be brief because brevity was security. It needed to be clear because clarity was discipline. And it needed to carry the weight of what had just happened without bending under it. Tell them the sky remembers. Rebuild the bells. Yale wrote it down. The dye glistened on the film, dark against the translucent surface. It would reach the nearest cells within hours, carried by runners through tunnels and ruins, through the same subsurface network that had carried the bell's ring an hour ago. It would reach the farthest cells within days. And when it arrived, Every cell leader would read the same 2 sentences and understand the same 2 things. The strike worked, and the work continues. Because this was not the end. Marin had never designed it to be the end. This was the first sound, the bell ringing, the crack appearing, the reminder delivered. The Varathari would repair and restore and file and optimize, and the human resistance would retreat into its tunnels and ruins and begin again. New bells, cast from new scavenged metal, tuned by new hands. New charges, stolen gram by gram from new mining allocations. New patience, the same patience, the patience that had carried them through 40 centuries of amber sky and polite broadcasts and quarterly reports. The next strike would be larger, or more targeted, or timed to coincide with something the Varathari could not anticipate because they could not conceive of a species that planned in millennia and communicated at walking speed, and named their resistance cells after missing candles. The candle in the crater was still burning. Marin watched it for a moment, the small flame holding steady against the stillness, the warm light pooling on stone that had once been marble and was now glass. Then she turned and descended the stairs back into the basement, back to the table made from a door, back to the strips of biodegradable film, back to the work. Behind her, through the open stairway, a thin line of light fell into the darkness of the command post. It was paler than it had been that morning. The amber was fading. And under it, faint and ancient and patient, the first ghost of blue was showing through. Above the ruins, the Varathari dropships fanned out across the damaged zones, their repair teams already filing their initial assessments, already noting the scope of the failure, already calculating restoration timelines. Their orbital station was already dispatching additional processing vessels. Their administrators were already composing the next broadcast, the next calm advisory, the next polite explanation that everything was under control and the variants would be corrected. But somewhere in their damage reports, in the careful columns of processor failures and grid degradation and relay losses, a number would appear that no Varathari administrator had ever seen before. A number that did not fit in any ledger, that could not be optimized or filed or noted in a margin. 209. The number of points across the planet where the failures had originated simultaneously. 209, not a random distribution, not a cascade from a single point of failure, not an infrastructure aging event, but a coordinated pattern that implied planning, communication, and execution, on a scale that the Varathari's models said was impossible for a species that communicated at walking speed and built its coordination tools from string and paper and memory. They would study that number. They would build models. They would file reports. They would optimize their security protocols and expand their sweep parameters and upgrade their sensor arrays. And in the tunnels beneath their feet, the runners were already moving, carrying a message on biodegradable film, the dye already fading in the pale new light that filtered through the cracks in the amber sky. The sky remembers, rebuild the bells. Marin Estelle sat in the basement and began planning the next strike. The candle in the crater above her was burning down, its wax pooling on the scorch-glazed stone, its flame steady and small and stubborn. It would last another 2 hours, maybe 3. Then it would go out, and the ruin would be dark again, and the Varathari would never know it had been there. But it had been there, and the next one would be there too, and the one after that. 4,000 years was a long time to remember, but humans had always been good at remembering the things that mattered most, not the things that were efficient, not the things that optimized quarterly output. The things that mattered, a blue sky, a cathedral, a candle that never went out. 11 million warships were still a promise, distant and patient as the stars. Somewhere beyond the amber shell, beyond the orbital station, beyond the Varathari's processing fleet, the human diaspora, the ones who had left before the clearing, the ones who had built in secret, the ones who had been counting the same years from the other side of the dark, was waiting. The resistance on Earth's surface was the bell. The fleet beyond the stars was the answer. And when it came, it would come the way humans did everything that mattered. Not efficiently, not politely, not with margin notes and quarterly reports. It would come with 11 million warships and the memory of every cathedral, every temple, every library, every song, every candle that the Varathari had burned in their 9 seconds of cleansing. It would come with the weight of 4,000 years of amber sky and the precision of a species that had learned to communicate at walking speed and plan in millennia, and build bells that ring once and matter forever. The sky was cracking, the bells were ringing, and underneath the amber the blue was coming back. It would take time. It always took time. But humans had 4,000 years of practice at waiting, and they had never, not once, not in 40 centuries of amber skies and polite broadcasts and careful optimization, forgotten what they were waiting for.